The Cold War wasn't just about ideology. It was a psychological war of fear. Fear of the enemy, fear of annihilation, fear of the unknown, and in the middle of this quiet war, Cuba. In 1959, a young rebel named Fidel Castro overthrew the US-backed dictator Batista and seized control of Cuba. At first, Americans watched with cautious curiosity. But when Castro aligned himself with the Soviet Union and turned communist, Washington went cold. Cuba wasn't just any island. It was just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. The idea of a communist stronghold right next door was unacceptable. President Dwight D. Eisenhower responded with trade embargoes and covert operations. But things were just getting started. In 1961, newly elected President John F. Kennedy authorized a CIA operation to overthrow Castro. The plan was to send exiled Cubans to invade Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. It was a disaster. The rebels were outnumbered, outgunned, and quickly defeated. The U.S. was humiliated. Kennedy took full responsibility. But Castro emerged stronger and more committed to Soviet support. After that failed invasion, Castro made a deal that would change the world. In secret, the Soviet Union began shipping nuclear missiles to Cuba, their goal to level the playing field. At the time, the U.S. had missiles in Turkey and Italy pointing at the Soviet Union. Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, saw Cuba as an opportunity to place their own missiles within striking distance of American cities. Throughout the summer of 1962, Soviet ships sailed to Cuba with launch pads, warheads, and troops disguised as agricultural workers. And America had no idea until on October 14th. 1962 ayudó pipeline captured photographs of missile installations being built in Cuba. When the images landed on President Kennedy's desk, the room went cold. Those missiles weren't theoretical. They were real and they were almost operational. The next 13 days would go down in history as the most dangerous in modern history. Kennedy assembled his closest advisors, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council EXCOM. Opinions clashed. Some wanted an immediate airstrike. Others called for diplomacy, but Kennedy made a bold decision. A naval blockade officially. He called it a quarantine to avoid war terminology. On October 22nd, he addressed the nation on live television. The American public was stunned. For the first time, the threat of nuclear war felt immediate and personal. Families bought canned goods. Schools rehearsed evacuation drills. Gas stations ran dry as people fled cities. The clock was ticking as U.S. warships surrounded Cuba. Soviet ships continued moving toward the blockade line. One wrong move, one missile launched. One ship boarded could trigger nuclear retaliation. Behind the scenes, the world's most powerful men wrote letters, traded ultimatums, and weighed options that could kill millions. But in public, they were silent. On October 27, a U.S. Navy group dropped depth charges near a Soviet submarine. To force it to surface what they didn't know, the sub was armed with a nuclear torpedo. The captain wanted to fire, but protocol required agreement from 3 officers. 2 said yes, 1 man, Vasili Arkhipov, said no. His refusal likely saved the world from full-scale nuclear war. He's a forgotten hero, but without him, there might have been no tomorrow. That same day, another U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba, and tension spiked. Kennedy's advisors pushed for airstrikes, but then 2 letters arrived from Khrushchev. The first was emotional, calling for peace. The second was harsher, demanding the U.S. remove its missiles from Turkey. Kennedy responded publicly to the first letter and privately agreed to the second. On October 28, 1962, Khrushchev announced that the missiles would be removed from Cuba. The world exhaled. The Cuban Missile Crisis left scars. Trust was broken. The world saw how close it came to catastrophe, but some good came from it. A direct hotline, the Red Telephone, was set up between Moscow and Washington. The 2 sides signed a nuclear test ban treaty the next year. It was the closest we've ever come to total nuclear war. And we survived, but only just... And that's why we tell this story. Not to scare, but to remember. Because history is fragile and peace is never guaranteed. If this story moved you, like and subscribe for more.